Hello. Good evening. I'm Kirsten Riak. I'm the historian and archivist here at the Park Avenue Armory, and I'm happy to welcome you all tonight, especially to the Armory, but also to the Veterans Room, which has a great link and connection with the topic we're going to hear about tonight. This year's Malkin Lectures are centered around popular entertainment and culture, including cartoons, which we had last month, which was fascinating, baseball, which is coming up next week, and pop music of the 19th century. Tonight's topic, Madison Square Garden, will connect the architecture of the Armory to New York's great entertainment palace. And so that connection is also, it's apt in the architecture and in the designers that we share, but also in that we have converted and transformed this once elite and inaccessible enclave of the militia into an art center for the public and for mixed genre of arts and entertainment and fun and for all ages. So I think that we feel an especial connection with that. Tonight I look forward to learning more about the similarities and the differences between the Armory and Madison Square Garden. Our speaker is the author Suzanne Hinman. She's been a curator, gallerist, museum director, and professor in American art history. She served as director of galleries at the Savannah College of Art and Design and owned her own private art gallery in Santa Fe. Her interest in the artists and architects of the American Gilded Age and the famed Cornish art colony in New Hampshire grew while associate director of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College. Her book, The Grandest Madison Square Garden, Art, Scandal, and Architecture in Gilded Age New York, was published just this May, and there will be copies for sale in our library next door after her talk, and she will sign books as well and answer any questions. So please join me in welcoming Suzanne Hinman.
Thank you, Kirsten. And the sound is good? No, a little more. And I have a scratchy hay fever throat, so to bear with me just a bit. Hello, how is that? Better? All right, wonderful. Thank you so much to the Park Avenue Armory for sharing this truly wondrous space with us. And thank you for joining me tonight for a reading from my new book, The Grandest Madison Square Garden, Art, Scandal, and Architecture in Gilded Age New York, just published this spring by Syracuse University Press as part of their series on New York history. The book is a result of 12 years of research and writing on the Gilded Age and Stanford White's Madison Square Garden, as well as Augustus Saint-Gaudens' two versions of the nude goddess Diana that topped its tower. While I hope it will be the definitive nonfiction work on the subject, I wanted to write for a general, not academic audience in a vivid, engaging manner in order, I hope, to make the reader feel like they are indeed standing out on Madison Square, a part of those remarkable events. So to begin from the abridged prologue, a reading for you. November 2nd, 1891. New York City, the diamond stick pin on the shirt front of America. Thousands were beginning to fill Madison Square and the streets surrounding it, standing out in the crisp evening air on Fifth Avenue, on Broadway, and on Madison, crowding in front of Manhattan's finest hotels, celebrated restaurants, and exclusive shops, fingers pointing, mouths agape, male and female, young and old, greenhorns off the boat, and old Fifth Avenue noodles. On that night, New Yorkers of all sorts had come from all over the city, and from the now nearby suburbs as well, brought in by ferry and bridge, railroad horse car, cable car, and elevated railway. At 7 o'clock, a sharp flood of light illuminated the graceful arcade of roofed arches on Madison Avenue that had been built in the Italian Renaissance style. It was a new sort of walkway, the first in the city, one meant to welcome and to shelter. It was constructed finally after a year of wrangling with the city fathers, who feared such a place would surely become a haven for loose women and thieves. Above the arches rose walls of shimmering buff yellow brick, their lavish terracotta ornament visible in the reflected light. Let churches claim the sharp and unforgiving Gothic style and banks the staid and solid Greek and Roman columns. This Renaissance style, with its richly decorated loggias, niches, colonnades, balustrades, belvederes, and magnificent tower, was for pleasure, for sport, for the arts, for merrymaking and make-believe. The crowd waited, and then suddenly 100 electric arc lights, 8,000 incandescent lights, and 2 of the world's most powerful searchlights bathed the new Madison Square Garden in a veritable pyramid of light. It was unlike anything ever seen in New York City, ever seen anywhere. At 93,000 square feet, it was simply the largest building in the world devoted solely to extravagance, elegance, sawdust, and splendor, all whipped up and tossed together in the heart of America's Gilded Age and its golden city. Nowhere were the fruits of American expansion and industrialization more gleefully gathered or more lavishly celebrated than here in Manhattan. And how welcome was this night's celebration, a momentary break from the nearly crushing issues of the day, a flood of immigration, domestic terrorism, political corruption, the overt display of wealth, recession, and a coming war half a world away. Sound familiar? As to location, and I'm sorry I can't really point, but as to location, the garden claimed the northeast corner of Madison Square, taking up the full block between Madison and 4th Avenues, East 26th and 27th Streets. And if you can see, it's just to the northeast there of the square. I'm sure you're familiar. And here you see a better view of the spot, the park, the tower, the magnificent tower off to the right there, and the split where Broadway and 5th Avenue meet and go off. Finished the previous June, New Yorkers had flocked to the Madison Square Garden amphitheater for concerts, revivals, the horse show, dog show, flower show, the prize fights, the circus, and 100 other events held in its vast oval arena. The great views, skillfully designed and unimpeded. But that night in November, the crowds were there for a different reason, to dedicate and celebrate the garden's Soaring Tower. Completed just weeks before, it was a fanciful creation in the style of Seville's Giralda, the Hispano-Moorish 12th century minaret that had been converted 400 years later to a cathedral bell tower by the addition of 100 feet of Renaissance columned folderol. At 319 feet, the Garden Tower was the tallest spot in the tallest city, the loftiest tower in the United States, the highest man-made structure in the country, second only to the Washington Monument. Madison Square Garden's fanciful, almost fairy tale complex was nearly complete, and with the addition the next spring of its festive roof garden, it would quite simply be the most magnificent playland in the world. Madison Square itself was quite the perfect location for this new palace of pleasure. For most of its life, the square had been known for its show of spectacle, its fast horses, a handful of mysterious murders, plenty of beautiful women, and some quite scandalous art. Formerly a drill field, a baseball playing field, a suburban resort, and then a society enclave, Madison Square served as the city's premier shopping and amusement center. And New Yorkers had long been accustomed to coming to this part of town for their entertainment. Just up Broadway stood the best new theaters, brightly lit by electric lamps, a gay white way, as it was known. But just another block west of the square was 6th Avenue, known as the wildest, wickedest street in the city for its concert saloons, all-night dance halls, French peep shows, high kickers, and various other forms of depravity, or so it was reported. This grand new Madison Square Garden was actually the second to stand on this spot. The first in 1873 was just a canvas tent over an old railroad yard, then was variously remodeled as shown here, first in the French Revival style and then in the Italian Revival style. But this second new garden was very much the creation of Stanford White. Too far. Soon to become America's most celebrated architect. He and his partners at McKim, Mead, and White had solidified the Beaux-Arts style. And we have William Dummy Mead, Charles McKim, and of course Stanford White there in the portrait. Borrowing from the past to combine the classical orders and monumental scale with richly colored marbles and carved 15th century Italian ornament, murals and mosaics, light and air, to create a grand new eclectic Renaissance Revival style. It was also very much an American style, sparking what some were calling an American Renaissance, that they believed would surely certify the country's role in the world as heir to the greatest of Western civilizations. With nearly 1,000 commissions eventually on the books, McKim, Mead, and White would continue to shape the New York landscape from Washington Square Arch, just nearing completion, to the magnificent Pennsylvania Station, still more than a decade away. And far beyond the city, the firm would leave its mark on across the country, culminating in a remodel of the White House and the National Mall in Washington, D.C. But on this night, or that night, all eyes were focused on the south side of the garden. At exactly 10 o'clock, the lights on the amphitheater went out, and then suddenly the garden's new tower was lit with incendiary red fire. Boom, crash, boom, again in a shower of color as bombs and rockets were set off over and over for a full hour. There among the smoke stood a tall, red-headed man, hot and grimy, his bristling mustache singed black, running among the installations, making certain every flare, bomb, and skyrocket and Roman candle was fired in its proper order. Stanford White had to fight hard for the garden, even harder for the tower. Faced with ever-rising costs, more than $4 million for the project, the Madison Square Garden Company had been ready to write off the tower, but White would not let that happen. Stanford White always had a fondness for towers. He had built some fine ones. As you see here, there had to be a tower that he knew, and he begged, pleaded, harangued, and hounded until the money was raised. For nearly 2 years, masons had been at work setting its 2 million creamy yellow bricks as the tower slowly reared its head over the roofs of the city. With all the cost cuts, it was not quite the fantastical tower he planned, but still it was damned impressive. At the horse show, no doubt prominent that evening were members of the Madison Square Garden Company Board of Directors, led by its president, legendary banker and financier J.P. Morgan. The board was composed of old and new money, railway presidents, industrialists, bankers, men from the California gold fields, financiers and speculators, all among the richest men in the country and leading figures of what White's old friend Mark Twain had dubbed the Gilded Age. Men whose money and power allowed them to live like princes had paid for this palace, for the boxes and the promenades to show off their wives, daughters, and horses. But the pleasures of the garden were not strictly for the rich. Anyone with the price of a ticket was admitted, and it was the new middle class, the managers, the engineers, the salesmen, the typewriters, the seamstresses, the new middle class that would have to fill the thousands of seats. The garden was not just for the few, it would belong to all New Yorkers and beyond, for it would capture the imagination of the entire country. Finally, the smoke cleared away, and the tower was lit up again, as it would be every night there was a concert, play, performance, prize fight, or extravaganza. One after another, each set of lights came on until all 1,300 were ablaze, illuminating its upper floors of private apartments and 5-columned loggias, cupolas, and lanterns, one set on top of the other, and each serving as an outlook over the city. 25 cents would buy a 30-second elevator ride to the tower's top for a stunning view never before seen by the human eye. And here's a bit of that view. Hard for us to imagine, but that no one had ever seen that before. Earlier on that opening day, some 10,000 visitors had paid their quarter for that view across the great expanse of the city. On the previous afternoon, November 1st, 1891, another crowd had gathered in Madison Square, more gentlemen than ladies, and many equipped with field glasses. The newspapers had made it known that a huge sculpture topping the tower's bullet-headed arched lantern of steel and iron would finally be unveiled, and that it would be a figure of the Roman goddess Diana, and that her costume might be skimpier than imagined. After her very dramatic unveiling, which is fully discussed in a later chapter, after her unveiling came a murmur and then a gasp from the crowd. There, standing on one tiptoe, was a gilded, hammered copper statue of Diana, virgin goddess of the chase, goddess of the moon, sister to Apollo of the sun, reigning nude except for a flying drape wound under her breasts and over one shoulder. Not tucked away in a gallery or museum, but stepping out freely and fearlessly into the gray air for all to see, her golden limbs shining against the darkening sky, the first sculpture to ever be so illuminated by electricity. This astounding yet very elegant figure had been created by the man who was quite likely America's finest sculptor, Augustus Saint-Gaudens. And here's Augustus. He had studied the great figural works of Greece, Rome, and the Renaissance, and then transformed them through his own modern eye, setting a new standard and a new direction for American sculpture. His Farragut monument, dedicated 10 years earlier, stood nearby in Madison Square. There followed some of his greatest public pieces, including the Standing Lincoln in Chicago and the Adams Memorial in Washington, D.C., all, like the Farragut, created in collaboration with Saint-Gaudens' dearest friend, Stanford White, who helped pick the sites and design the settings and bases. There she is. This decidedly unclothed Diana stood poised on her left foot, her right leg bent behind, her bow drawn, arrow held in place. Diana of the crosswinds, her arrow pointing directly into the wind. She was a wind vane, but one before which all other weathercocks pale and dwindle, gushed the New York Times. Achingly beautiful, her slim, almost boyish young body, 18 feet tall, of gilded hammered copper, turned readily in a light breeze. Yet she would soon be replaced on the tower by an even lovelier version, just 5 feet shorter, while the first was shipped to Chicago to reign over the glorious 1893 White City at the World's Fair, until quite mysteriously disappearing after a terrible fire. And that's a whole other story and another chapter. And while you may have heard that all New York was shocked and horrified by Diana's nudity, in actuality, the opposite was true. Diana was adored as the city's golden goddess and patron deity. It is true that a few religious groups objected, but they were largely ignored. And New Yorkers considered it a matter of pride that their city was bold and sophisticated enough to support such a figure that Philadelphia or Boston or Chicago would not tolerate. While a shower of fire whirled about her head and red and blue fires burned at her feet, Diana's sculptor likely stood with members of the board. Let's see if we can go on here. City officials watching the ceremony with perhaps some pride, yet a good bit of unease. Saint-Gaudens, with his honesty and utter lack of affection, was unparalleled in the city with warm friends and supporters. But there was nothing he liked less than attention, and he was still recovering from the terrible error made at the foundry in Ohio where Diana was cast, where they ran the mounting pole through the heel of her foot instead of the toe. Perhaps off to one side stood a cluster of men and women dressed with a certain bohemian flair. They might have been chums and colleagues from the days in Paris or St. Gaudens' studio in Rome, or for one of the private clubs here in New York that kept their membership secret, reserving special apartments for their physiological explorations, as one member described them. It was artists who made up St. Gaudens and White's circle of friends, painters like John Singer Sargent and Louis Comfort Tiffany. Most relevant for us who stand in this veterans' room tonight is the friendship and collaboration between White and Tiffany that resulted in this most glorious space. Both men shared a love of the so-called Oriental or Moresque style, an appreciation and appropriation of Islamic art that may have begun for White during his first visit to Paris in 1878, bunking at St. Gaudens' apartment and spending evenings together at painter Francis Millet's Montmartre studio. Oh, and just a comment, that was a group of artist pals who would meet every Sunday evening at St. Gaudens' studio for the smoking concerts, and I'm afraid to step off, but I think you can see Stanford White here, the very first, and St. Gaudens a few heads over to the left. Okay, Frank Millet. In those days, Frank Millet's apartment in Paris was stuffed full of hanging lamps, Damascene scimitars, brass and ivory, inlaid furniture, and other souvenirs of his Middle East travels. Frank Millet would also be involved in the decoration of this room, the beautiful frieze at the top of the wall that surrounds us, a history of war, executed with painter George Ewell on the right, his work on the right. And Frank would tragically die in the sinking of the Titanic. Then there was Stan and Bessie White's unforgettable honeymoon trip to Constantinople, a city Stanford White termed the most wonderful place in the world, and the mosque full of antique tiles he bought there but were lost in a shipwreck. So many artists of the late 19th century were fascinated by the lands of the Near, Middle, and Far East, where travel was now made easier by trade, occupation, and colonization, as well as the impact of Romantic literature, which fostered a taste for exoticism and Oriental fantasies. But there was also genuine interest in the culture and way of life in a world so different from their own. As you may well know, Louis Comfort Tiffany began his artistic career as a landscape painter. And here you see one of his pieces. Traveling through North Africa and Spain, fascinated by Byzantine and Islamic pattern, light, and color. Upon his return to New York, Tiffany continued to paint scenes of mosques, camels, and snake charmers, while developing a passion for acquiring objects of near, middle, and far eastern manufacture. Tiffany also began experimenting with glass in an attempt to create decorative tiles inspired by the dazzling Byzantine mosaics he had seen on his travels. And here you see the Favre glass and some of the mosaics. And of course, you only have to glance past me to see some of his work. In late 1879, Tiffany had approached Stanford White to serve as consultant on the decoration of the new armory for New York's 7th Regiment, the silk-stocking home guard known for its socially prominent members. Tiffany had just entered a partnership with textile designer Candace Wheeler, landscape painter Samuel Coleman, and designer Lockwood Forrest to create the firm L.C. Tiffany and Associated Artists, with the purpose of encouraging good taste in America. The idea of a group of artists working together to create harmonious interiors of fine quality had been the goal of the arts and crafts movement, born in England in the 1860s and introduced to America in the 1870s through the art and writings of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and then the work of William Morris, the movement's most influential designer. And he, too, founded a network of artists, designers, and craftsmen. Tiffany's Associated Artists also took direction from the British aesthetic movement, with its ideal of beauty for its own sake, that helped to make the decoration of rooms an endeavor worthy of fine artists. It was believed that every bit of decoration placed in a room, floor, walls, ceilings, should be handmade, of finest quality, and a thing of beauty, while still of absolute utility. The perfection of such rooms, such as this, not only reflected a high level of cultivation, but was also said to inspire moral improvement. 32-year-old Tiffany and his firm began work on this 7th Regimental Armory in April 1880, with 27-year-old Stanford White as consulting architect, decorating this veterans' room and then the adjoining library. And I feel a bit silly showing a slide when all you have to do is look around, but it may be a bit easier to see. And of course, a drawing of the library where I'll be signing books later. When this club and meeting room was complete, most agreed that the sumptuous and quite fanciful melange of Greek, Moresque, Celtic with a dash of Egyptian, Persian, and Japanese was quite remarkable, if not the most original decor ever seen in America. And just a few bits here by Tiffany of the glass windows and his mosaic. The new Romantic and Orientalist mode of popular, stereotypical good taste that incorporated the exotic, the sensuous, the opulent, and the unexpected was now in play, and quickly spread from the world stage to the make-believe world of arts and amusement. And this was evident, for example, in the 1882 New York Casino Theater, inspired by Moorish Spain. Sarah Bernhardt's widely performed role as Cleopatra, offered at the Madison Square Garden Theater, and Every Home's Turkish corner with a pile of fringed pillows found in every well-decorated American home, as well, of course, as Madison Square Garden's fabulous tower being dedicated tonight. Madison Square had always been friendly to artists. Just 2 blocks away stood the National Academy of Design, the art dealers, galleries, interior designers, like the Herder brothers, who designed 5 more rooms in this building, and from whom McKim, Mead, and White would sublet office space. Okay. Back to Madison Square. Standing out that night on the square may have been some of the best-known female models of the day, of which more than a few would later claim Diana's figure as their own. Perhaps a striking young woman stood a little farther off, one who spoke with a Swedish accent. Davida, as she was called, claimed Augustus Saint-Gaudens' heart and his second son as her own, and was likely the model for Diana's face. Probably not her body. She was still recovering from that pregnancy. But no doubt out in the street, clasping thin wraps against the chill, stood hundreds, if not thousands, of other young women, immigrant or native, from foreign lands or farms and mill towns around the country, with perhaps more than a few wondering, with a bit of fear mixed with delight, whether someday they too might find themselves in a sculptor's studio or a classroom full of art students dropping a robe to pose in the tout and scramble, a corruption of the tout ensemble, the altogether. Some may have known the more hidden details of Stanford White and Augustus Saint-Gaudens' lives, the things that went on in the various clubs and hideaways, like the special apartment within Diana's tower. But it was not until America's most famous architect was brutally murdered in an act of passion here in the shadow of Diana's tower that more shocking allegations were screamed out in newspaper headlines worldwide. It had been quite the journey to this golden virgin goddess twirling about the tallest tower. The story of Diana and the grandest Madison Square Garden has remained a tale largely untold, and on that November night in 1891, the story was still far from over. And at this point, as a postscript, I want to add the explanation to a question people so often ask. What happened to this fabulous palace of pleasure? And people often say, did it crumble? Did it just fall apart? No, it did not. The reason it no longer stands is purely economic. Despite all that went on there, but despite its spot lodged deep in the heart of New York's cultural, social, and athletic heart, Madison Square Garden never turned a profit. From that day during construction when Stanford White approved the first cost override, it had mostly run at a loss. It never paid promised stock dividends. The board of directors had to dip into their own pockets to cover the ever-increasing taxes, salaries, insurance, advertising, etc., of a plant that by the 1920s had an operating cost of $1,500 a day. The garden needed to make at least $10,000 a week to break even, and this rarely happened. Not unexpectedly, Madison Square had been left behind as the city's hotels, theaters, and restaurants continued to be built northward. And New Yorkers had come to expect the all-too-frequent newspaper headline warning of the garden's crushing failure, pending sale, imminent demise, etc. In 1920, the New York Life, the company, held a mortgage on the mortgage on the garden,
and leased it to George Tex Rickard, a well-known sports promoter from out west who decided to focus on athletics. While stripping the tower of much of its interior trappings, workmen found it was honeycombed with hidden stairways and secret passages, quite likely designed by Stanford White himself, and articles appeared with White's ghost-like image hovering above the garden. The garden did hang on and make something of a profit, but in the spring of 1924, New York Life announced plans to erect a new 40-story corporate headquarters on the site. The site had become more valuable than the building itself. We build up only to tear down. We have no regard for things merely because they are beautiful. They must return to us 6% on our investment or out they go, lamented one art critic, and so it was with the garden. On the afternoon of May 6, 1925, the figure of Diana was lowered off the tower and swaddled in burlap for transport to the Franklin Fireproof Warehouse in Brooklyn, where unfortunately she was to rest in storage for the next 7 years, until she was finally rescued by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she remains today, and where I will be visiting on Thursday to speak to her, people there on her marvelous rescue by the city of Philadelphia. Following Diana's descent, the raising of the Garden Tower began in earnest. The walls had to be torn apart. Oops, I'm sorry, there she is in Philadelphia, I'm sorry. The walls had to be torn apart, literally brick by brick, sledgehammer, crowbar, pneumatic hammer. Despite the lack of upkeep and a few structural problems in its grimy gray appearance, Madison Square was found to be generally in excellent condition, solidly and carefully built. According to expert engineers who examined it post-mortem, had the garden been permitted to remain and reasonable maintenance performed, there was no reason why it should not have stood for hundreds of years. But a third Madison Square Garden would soon follow on 8th Avenue between 49th and 50th, and then a fourth in 1968, where the glorious Penn Station had once stood, and that's all I'm going to say about that one. Although it no longer stood, memories of the grandest Madison Square Garden would be preserved among the countless copies of its tower and the Giralda that inspired it across the United States, from California to Florida, and here in this room as well. So thank you. Again, what a thrill to be in this room.
Anybody have any questions? Over there? No?
Could you say something about the interior decoration of the Madison Square Garden, and in specific, was Tiffany involved?
No, it was remarkable. I wish I had a slide to show you. It was remarkable because it was so plain. And that is such a modern way of thinking, really. There was virtually no decoration in the amphitheater. It was, there were wonderful Pratt trusses and phoenix columns that allowed for that huge space with no posts, no poles to block your view, and that was one of Stanford White's wonderful achievements. But it was left very, very plain to allow the spectacle and the audience to be the focus of attention. There was some beautiful tile work in the bathrooms. There were beautiful, two beautiful theaters. There was a theater and then a concert room, and maybe that's what you're thinking of, that were beautifully decorated off to the side. and were inspired by Stanford White's Newport casino work, etc. Those were said to be, looked like a king's throne room, and done in Louis XVI sort of style, and it became Golden White, became the nickname of the firm because of its lavish, beautiful decoration in those places. Is that what you were thinking?
You never hear about anything other than the concert hall.
Right, right. But the grand amphitheater itself was left very bare and plain, simple, so that the architecture could be appreciated, the steel work.
We have a question here.
Oh, yes, thank you. I was wondering, what was the public attitude towards building something that was so for entertainment, and who supported it? What was, did the city pay for part of it, or were they big realtors?
It was the board. It was the first, the people who actually paid for the first construction was the horse lovers, the National Horse Association. They wanted a place that would be beautiful and large enough to host the National Horse Show. So it was the horse lovers who put up the first money at J.P. Morgan, et cetera. They tried to sell shares. It didn't really go over well with the public in terms of investing. So they were always a bit on the edge. They were always having to pay out of their own pockets the taxes and insurance, et cetera. People loved it, but it was a huge space. It seated like 16,000 people. And again, the costs were very high, so it had a problem making a profit just to cover those figures. And the city never really supported it.
I wanted to ask, thank you very much, about the Seidel Promenade, which was the name and the entrance to the building when it was down.
The arcade?
Yes. Now, is that named after someone named Seidl? Would that be named for someone who donated money? Was it named the way buildings are named today?
Yes. That was the orchestra. The Seidel
So
Works.
it wasn't that they were investing, that they didn't pay for the,
Not that
it was just that I see it was the
yes,
musical group.
yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
And as
Hi.
I said, there was suspicion, there was suspicion about the arcade, and building owners, business owners, did not want an arcade. They thought it would obscure the entrances to their stores, and people wouldn't come in, and it would badly affect their business. So it was a real fight to get that arcade, and then it was copied elsewhere. Yes, I'm sorry.
Hi, what is the relation of the maquette in the Metropolitan Museum of Art to the full statue?
Oh, okay. There's one. It's not really a maquette. You're talking about a figure about that tall of Diana. They run from 3 feet to 21 inches to 18 inches. The actual, more of a maquette is at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, where he was working on it and then gave it to Stanford White as a gift. Saint-Gaudens was always running short of funds, always in need of more money, and so he decided to manufacture reductions of the figure of Diana. That's what you're talking about, right? And had them run off at a foundry in Paris. His wife rather took over the business. They were sold through Tiffany and other shops and galleries in the U.S. There were at least 3 different versions and subversions of Diana, cast in bronze, and sold for, I think, $200 at Tiffany's.
Yeah.
And they were required good decorating. Edith Wharton said every well-decorated home had to have a nice piece of art in it.
Can you,
So you were, how well documented, into that, two questions. How well documented are the interiors? Detail, rooms, ceilings, what have you?
in picture form. There are some pictures, newspaper accounts of the day. Also, engineering and architecture magazines have some things. There are some, not tons of them, but there are a few.
You just said something I hadn't heard before, which there was retail on the lower level, on the arcade.
Oh, no. Near the nearby stores did not like the idea of an arcade. There were not retail stores within the within the Madison Square Garden. It was neighboring. They just thought it would be damaging to business if the city allowed them.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the rooftop. And there was
The roof garden?
the roof garden. I mean, is it something that would be recognizable to us today in terms of a public space or a restaurant or?
Roof gardens had started a little bit. It was not the first one. There was several. There was a couple in New York, and property owners realized that you couldn't just build a cafe on Fifth Avenue. There wasn't the space, so they went to the top of their buildings, and it was cool in the summer and pleasant, and there were usually concerts and a bar up there. The roof garden became quite popular in the summer. They would, when the weather wasn't quite so nice, apparently they hired someone in a straw boater and who'd sit there going, "Oh, isn't it a lovely evening?" And people are wrapped up and shivering. But it was a wonderful space. People who bought tickets for the theater and the amphitheater there was sort of a punch system. You could then go up. You were allowed to go up to the roof garden, and there was entertainment and musical performances, musicals performed up there, and it was a wonderful utilization in a very expensive space. Real estate.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please.
Yeah.